Welcome to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar on the accusation of Israel as an apartheid state. Characterized as an inhumane act akin to a crime against humanity, apartheid concerns one racial group's systematic oppression and dominance of another. In the wake of a widely publicized Human Rights Watch report accusing Israel of the crime of apartheid, a UN Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry was formed, which is also poised now to accuse Israel of apartheid. To discuss this inquiry, its mandate, and the potential connection with initiatives against Israel at the International Criminal Court, it's a great pleasure to be joined by Professor Orde Kittrie. Professor Kittrie is a leading expert on international law, particularly as it relates to the Middle East. He is the author of Lawfare, Law as a Weapon of War. He is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a professor of law at Arizona State University, and a research fellow in the Office of Legal Affairs of NATO's Supreme Allied Commander. He served at the US Department of State, helping to negotiate a treaty to combat nuclear terrorism, and he's testified before committees of the US Senate, House of Representatives, and various state legislatures. This year, Professor Kittrie was awarded the Serge Lazarev Prize, presented by NATO for exceptional contributions to it in the legal arena. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please submit your questions into the Q&A section. Professor Kittrie, it's a pleasure to have you here with us to discuss the different definitions of apartheid and its use against Israel. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you in particular to the Turners and Ms. Hausdorff for sponsoring this event. I want to first note that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not on behalf of any of the organizations with which I'm affiliated. With that, let's turn to substance. So often in the Middle East policy arena, we focus on negative developments that have just occurred, often after it's too late to do anything about them. I'm here to provide you with a heads up about a negative development that has just begun to occur and which has thus far received very little attention from the community of lawyers who are supportive of Israel. There is, in my view, still time to prevent or mitigate the damage. The bottom line is that a commission of inquiry, I'll sometimes refer to it as the COI or the 2021 COI, a commission of inquiry was created in May by the UN Human Rights Council. It's preparing to turbocharge the legal and political challenges to Israel's legitimacy by falsely labeling Israel as an apartheid state and by pressuring the International Criminal Court to take action against Israeli leaders for purported war crimes and acts of apartheid. When the UNHRC's Goldstone Commission about a decade ago slammed Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu was so concerned at the time that he said, quote, "We face three major strategic challenges: the Iranian nuclear program, rockets aimed at our civilians, and Goldstone," end quote. To my mind, the recently created commission is far more dangerous, including because it has a much broader mandate than the Goldstone Commission, which did not, for example, include apartheid allegations. In my presentation, for which I've just given you the nutshell, I'll first discuss the 2021 COI, or Commission of Inquiry, its mandate and its members. Then I'll focus on how it is laying the groundwork to accuse Israel of apartheid. I'll discuss the COI's invented definition of apartheid, what the legal definitions of apartheid actually are, why it's incorrect to say that Israel is engaged in apartheid, and then I'll provide some very preliminary options for responding. The 2021 COI is scheduled to present its first report to the UN Human Rights Council in June 2022. Efforts to influence the 2021 COI should begin long before then. Influencing the COI and minimizing the damage it causes will, it seems to me, require development and implementation over the coming months of a sophisticated and proactive multi-pronged strategy. So what is this commission? Well, the new UNHRC Commission is titled the International Commission of Inquiry to investigate violations in the occupied territory, including East Jerusalem and in Israel. It was created a May 27th UNHRC resolution, which was reportedly drafted by the PLO and was formally submitted for a vote by Pakistan and Palestine. It passed the UNHRC in the wake of anger at Israel over the May 2021 conflict between Israel and Hamas. Now, this is not the first time the UNHRC has established a controversial body to investigate Israel. For example, the UN fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict, created by UNHRC resolution January 2009, issued the Goldstone report that was highly critical of Israel and lenient towards its adversaries. It was that report which Netanyahu deemed one of Israel's three major strategic challenges. 6 years later, an independent International Commission of Inquiry for the Occupied Palestinian Territory, created by the UNHRC in July 2014, released a report a year later that was nearly as critical of Israel, while similarly lenient towards its adversaries. However, as I previewed, the new COI will be even more problematic for Israel than these prior two investigations. Its mandate is broader chronologically, geographically, and substantively. The previous investigations were focused essentially on producing a one-time report on violations of the law of armed conflict and of international human rights law, which occurred in the, quote, occupied Palestinian territory during a particular outbreak of violence. For example, the January 2009 and summer 2014 Gaza conflict. In contrast, the new COI's mandate is explicitly, quote, ongoing, meaning it is to exist in perpetuity, and it is required to issue annual reports about violations not only in the, quote, occupied Palestinian territory, but also for the first time in Israel itself, pre-1967 Israel. The 2021 COIs, the new COI's substantive mandate, includes, as did the previous ones, violations of the law of armed conflict and of international human rights law during the spring 2021 outbreak of Gaza violence. But it adds to this another element, namely to investigate, quote, and this is key language, quote, all underlying root causes of recurrent tensions, instability, and protraction of conflict, including systematic discrimination and repression based on national, ethnic, racial, or religious identity. The mandate's inclusion of, quote, systematic discrimination and repression is clearly designed to lay the groundwork for the COI making the false charge that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid. The mandate's inclusion of a requirement to investigate, quote, systematic discrimination and repression on all these grounds was clearly inspired by a 213-page report falsely accusing Israel of committing the crime against humanity of apartheid, which was published the prior month by Human Rights Watch. In its report on April 27, 2001, HRW directly accused Israel of committing apartheid in the, quote, occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and the HRW report laid the groundwork for, although it did not directly accuse Israel, did not explicitly accuse Israel of committing apartheid within the pre-1967 borders. On this basis, HRW's 213-page report in April 2021 called on the UN to create a, quote, international commission of inquiry to investigate systematic discrimination and repression based on group identity in the Palestinian territories and Israel. On May 27th, 2021, the UNHRC's resolution did exactly what HRW had recommended in its lengthy report exactly 1 month before. I'll shortly discuss why the accusation that Israel is engaged in apartheid is wrong, but I'll first discuss the three members chosen to lead the 2021 COI and why they seem tailor-made for leveling the charge of apartheid at Israel. On July 22nd, the UNHRC announced the appointment of 3 members, a total of 3 members, Navi Pillay, Milun Kothari, and Chris Sadati, to serve as the members of the COI. The appointment of Pillay as chair, Kothari and Sadati, each of whom has, in my view, a history of exceptionally strong hostility towards Israel, adds to concerns based on the mandate that the COI has no intention of conducting an objective inquiry. It rather appears that the COI has prejudged Israeli guilt and will use its investigations and reports to make the strongest case it can that Israel has committed not only war crimes, of which the UNHRC has previously accused Israel, but also the crime of apartheid, a charge which the UNHRC has rarely, if ever, before leveled against Israel, but is, again, as I mentioned, referenced in the mandate. So why is Navi Pillay the perfect person to do this? Well, she brings the credential useful for accusing Israel of engaging in apartheid, or having been a South African judge. She also understands the ICC, the International Criminal Court, having served as an ICC judge for 5 years. In addition, she has a track record of bashing Israel while she served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2008 to 2014. Pillay, in that position, repeatedly and caustically accused Israel of committing war crimes and declared that, quote, the Israeli government treats international law with perpetual disdain. At the same time, by the way, Pillay reportedly said nothing at all about human rights abuses in dozens of countries, which, unlike Israel, are actually among the worst of the worst. Dozens of countries that received the worst, quote, not free reading from the respective Freedom House, Pillay had nothing to say about them while she served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Obama administration was so concerned by Pillay's hostility towards Israel that it reportedly blocked Pillay from being renewed for an additional 4-year term as High Commissioner. U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee Chair and the ranking minority member also opposed the extension, saying Pillay had, quote, repeatedly demonstrated bias against the state of Israel. Could also talk a little bit about the other 2 members of the commission during a Q&A, but I want to move on to the allegation that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid. Why does it matter if the Commission of Inquiry makes such a finding? Well, this charge would be a return to the years between 1975 and 1991, when a UN General Assembly resolution was in place that determined that, quote, Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, end quote. But a finding of apartheid would take the Zionism is a form of racism allegation a step further. The false charge of engaging in apartheid, the abhorrent racist ideology of the South African white regime, is clearly designed to normalize calls for doing to Israel the same thing that was done to white South Africa, asphyxiating it. The apartheid label would also be particularly dangerous for Israel because it serves to delegitimize the entire national enterprise of Israel. While numerous countries have been accused of the occasional overly aggressive military action, the obvious remedy for which is new rules of engagement by its military, an apartheid state implicitly deserves the same fate as that of white-ruled South Africa. Now, neither the COI, the Commission of Inquiry, nor the UN Human Rights Council has the legal authority to actually impose penalties on governments, countries, or individual persons. However, the COI's investigations and reports seem designed to provide ammunition and prodding to 2 processes that do have teeth. The first is the already existing International Criminal Court investigation of alleged Israeli war crimes, including with regard to combat and with regard to West Bank settlements. The COI mandate and membership indicate that the COI will pressure the ICC to both continue its existing investigation of Israeli officials for allegedly committing war crimes and also inappropriately add to the investigation the international crime of apartheid. Unlike most treaties, the ICC, whose mandate explicitly includes the crime of apartheid, has a mechanism and personnel empowered to investigate, prosecute, and impose penalties for violations. It's particularly striking that the new COI's mandate largely consists of tasks clearly designed to collect evidence to be used to pressure the ICC to investigate Israel and to serve as ammunition should the ICC choose to proceed. These tasks include, for example, to quote, collect, consolidate, and analyze evidence in order to maximize the possibility of its admissibility in legal proceedings. So the COI, which clearly is not a legal body itself, has as one of its main elements of its mandate, collecting evidence for legal proceedings. Well, there's only one place where those legal proceedings might take place, and that is the ICC. It's interesting to note that the 2014 COI had a mandate that did not include such an explicit tasking to develop evidence for legal proceedings. Its report, nevertheless, included evidence that pushed the ICC a long way toward opening the current formal investigation of alleged Israeli war crimes. Given its explicit mandate, the report of the new COI can be expected to push the ICC hard to accelerate and expand that investigation. Former Prime Minister Netanyahu has described the existing ICC investigation of Israel as, quote, a strategic threat to the state of Israel, to IDF soldiers, to the commanders. The Israeli government has reportedly prepared a list of several hundred current and former Israeli officials, including Netanyahu and current Minister Benny Gantz, who could be subject to arrest abroad if the ICC moves forward against Israel for alleged war crimes. Should the ICC additionally move forward against Israel for allegedly committing the crime of apartheid, hundreds more current and former Israeli civilian officials could be vulnerable to arrest abroad. Another recent development, which could be turbocharged by the new COI, is the UNHRC's own blacklist, published in February 2020, of companies allegedly doing business with Israeli settlements in the West Bank. The list, as some of you may know, includes Israel's leading banks and providers of telecom, energy, water, and transportation services, as well as several leading American and European companies. The Bds Campaign, which seeks to replicate against Israel the isolation that played a major role in bringing down South Africa's actual apartheid regime, has called for boycott of and divestment from companies on the UNHRC blacklist. Relatively few major Western entities have jumped on the blacklist bandwagon thus far, but an apartheid charge issued by the 2021 COI and endorsed by the UNHRC could serve as a tipping point. Okay, so how is the apartheid charge wrong? One could write a lengthy point-by-point analysis rebutting the errors in HRW's report, which mischaracterized the facts of South African apartheid, mischaracterized the situation of Arabs in Israel in the disputed territories, and mischaracterized the international legal definition of apartheid. The bottom line is that the South African situation and the Israeli situation are very different, and Israel is not committing the crime of apartheid as defined by international law. International law's prohibition of the crime of apartheid is very specific, and it's contained in two treaties. One is a special anti-apartheid treaty, which defines apartheid as, and I'm going to read this slowly because the definition is important, defines apartheid as, quote, inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. The second major international law prohibition of apartheid is contained in the Icc Charter Treaty, often referred to as the Rome Statute, which defines apartheid as inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic repression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. The two definitions of apartheid are very specific, and they both include race as an indispensable element. Indeed, the definitions are so specific that it appears that no country since the end of South African apartheid has been formally deemed to merit that label by the UN or by an international tribunal. The apartheid label's inapplicability to Israel is clear. First, unlike South Africa's apartheid system, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not about race, the pivotal word in the two international law definitions of apartheid. Israeli Jews include people who look white, brown, and black. The roughly half of Israeli Jews whose families lived in Arab countries tend to be physically indistinguishable from non-Jewish Arabs. That the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not about race is very important. Influential institutions have thus far dismissed the apartheid charge against Israel on that very basis. For example, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is considered a very influential interpreter of human rights law and the law of war. Jacques de Mayo, who heads the ICRC delegation to Israel and the PA, responded as follows when he was asked whether Israel engages in apartheid. He said, quote, "The Red Cross was very familiar with the regime that prevailed in South Africa during the apartheid period, and we are responding to all those who raised their claim of apartheid against Israel. No, there's no apartheid here, no regime of superiority of race, of denial of basic human rights to a group of people because of their alleged racial inferiority. There is," he said, he continued, "a bloody national conflict whose most prominent and tragic characteristic is its continuation over the years, decades long, and there is a state of occupation, not apartheid," said the representative of the ICRC to Israel and the PA. So how are Human Rights Watch and the COI doing what they're doing? Well, presumably in recognition of the fact that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not about race, HRW departed from the two treaties' legal race-based definitions of apartheid and instead redefined apartheid to include, quote, "systematic discrimination and repression based on national or ethnic origin." In doing so, it unpersuasively extrapolated from legal instruments, including the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. As we saw, 1 month after HRW came out with its report and its invented definition, the UNHRC then echoed HRW's invented broad definition of apartheid in the new COI's mandate. Now, some might say, well, this is a technicality, race. My view is that even if apartheid were to be legally redefined to include national, ethnic, or religious identity, the situation of non-Jewish Arabs in Israel would not fit even this invented definition of apartheid. A comparison with the facts of actual South African apartheid makes clear why it doesn't fit. Under South Africa's apartheid system, Black persons had no right to vote, hold political office, or use quote unquote white universities, hospitals, ambulances, benches, or bathrooms. In contrast, the 20% of Israeli citizens who are Arabs have more political rights and civil liberties in Israel than they do in any Arab majority country. According to Freedom House, Israeli Arabs vote. They have political parties, including one which currently holds the balance of power in Israel's parliamentary government. Israeli Arabs use the same facilities and receive the same medical care as Jews, and they occupy positions of power, including as justices on its Supreme Court, ministers in its cabinet, leading scientific researchers and entrepreneurs, prominent physicians, and major generals in its military. In fact, the high school graduation rate, as well as the rate of graduates meeting university entrance requirements, is actually higher for Israeli Arab Christians than it is for Israeli Jews. And rather than being excluded from Israel's prestigious Technion Israel Institute of Technology, Israeli Arabs actually comprise 21% of the students. Now, the situation in the West Bank and Gaza is more complicated. There are legitimate criticisms to be made of Israeli policy towards them, but calling these policies apartheid is simply false. There's no intent on Israel's part to maintain, quote, "an institutionalized regime of systematic repression and domination by one racial group." as apartheid is defined by the Icc Charter and similarly by the Special Anti-Apartheid Treaty. Aside from the fact that Palestinian Arabs are not a racial group, a border, including a disputed one, is not a denial of citizenship rights, but rather a demarcation between two societies. Indeed, Israel in 2005 entirely withdrew from Gaza its military, civilian officials, and citizens. If the Palestinians would ever accept the right of Israel to exist in peace and security and accept Israel's very reasonable border offers, the current friction between the Israeli military and Palestinian Arabs would vastly decrease and hopefully one day be reduced to that between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Egypt and Jordan. Israel's policy is one of self-defense, not subjugation. South African apartheid was intended to permanently benefit the white population to the detriment of other races. In contrast, Israel and every single one of its citizens exited Gaza in 2005, with Israel declining to reoccupy the Strip despite extensive rocket fire against Israeli civilians from there. And Israel in 1993 turned much of the West Bank and the vast majority of its population over to the PA. Since the Oslo Accord entered into force, the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza have been subject to Palestinian and not Israeli laws, courts, police, prisons, and taxes. In addition, Israel has repeatedly offered a larger Palestinian state in almost all, up to 94% of the territory of the West Bank. Israel, unlike most other modern democracies, has in recent decades faced repeated armed attacks designed to destroy it, and many of its neighborhood, including Hamas and Iran, continue to issue genocidal threats against it. Israel's military presence in parts of the West Bank and responses to attacks from Gaza are designed not to engage in racial discrimination, but instead to protect Israeli security against real threats, so long as the Palestinian leadership continues to reject peace agreements and those threats continue. Left unchecked, the new COI seems poised to give a major boost, a UN stamp of endorsement, to the malicious lie that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid and thus deserves to be destroyed in the same manner as the old racist South Africa. The new COI also seems poised to pressure the ICC to continue its existing investigation of alleged Israeli war crimes. All of this will, in my view, hinder the cause of peace by encouraging the Palestinian leadership to continue rejecting a peaceful solution to the conflict. So what can be done about it? Well, two preliminary thoughts, and with this I'll be closing my presentation, and very interested to hear during Q&A or afterwards other thoughts that folks might have about what to do about this challenge. One is there's a need to substantively counter the apartheid charge. The Biden administration and other Western governments should find appropriate ways to reiterate and elaborate upon the view, which, by the way, the Biden administration has already expressed, that Israel's actions do not constitute apartheid. The US and other Western governments should also work to counter efforts by the new COI and others to change the legal definition of apartheid in this effort to facilitate slapping that label on Israel. There are certain foreign governments that I think look like they could be helpful in putting pressure on the COI. For example, Israel apparently spurred several governments, Germany, Australia, Austria, Brazil, the Czech Republic, Uganda, to recently submit written documents to the ICC, each positing that Palestine cannot transfer criminal jurisdiction over its territory to the ICC because the PA does not meet the international law criteria for statehood. If they were willing to take those positions on behalf of Israel in the ICC with regard to, I think, the maybe more controversial view that Palestine is not a state, they may well be willing to go to bat for Israel vis-a-vis the scurrilous apartheid charge. There are also the countries that have dropped out of Durban 4, a number of them that potentially also could be allies. It's worth noting that the apartheid charge is particularly ludicrous now, as Mansour Abbas, a Muslim Arab citizen of Israel, controls the balance of power in Israel's parliament. This is totally inconsistent with the type of subjugation associated with apartheid. Supporters of a truthful narrative should do more to publicize this and many other examples of Arab citizens' leadership roles in Israel. Relevant non-governmental organizations and experts should also push back against the effort by HRW and the UNHRC to invent a new, broader definition of apartheid that goes beyond race. Second, beyond the substantive legal arguments, and with this I conclude, we have heard repeatedly that in Geneva, where the UNHRC is based, Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and others tell people that they are under enormous pressure to pursue Israel, under enormous political pressure to pursue Israel. And so the question is, who's countering that pressure? Who is reaching out to the COI, to the UNHRC, to the member states of the UNHRC, to the High Commissioner to say, look, this is nonsense. Finally, I would note that the official anti-Semitism definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance may be helpful. As you may know, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has 34 member countries, and the official anti-Semitism definition includes the following example, quote, claiming the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, end quote. On this basis, it would appear that calling Israel an apartheid state is apparently anti-Semitic. Now, I'm not one who's eager to throw around charges of anti-Semitism, but I just point out that that's what the definition says. That's what the official definition says. And with that, I conclude my remarks, and I'm happy to take questions and comments.
Professor, thank you very much indeed. We've had the questions streaming in already. Perhaps if I may use my prerogative and pick up in the first instance on an issue you touched upon. It is pretty obvious that Israeli law makes no distinction on the basis of race. Against that, we have everything that you've described in the context of this campaign. Is this campaign simply a ruse by Israel's enemies to hijack the notion of human rights and seek to distract focus away from the real agenda, the destruction of Israel? I believe the term you used was asphyxiation.
Well, I would say that it's not so much a ruse designed to distract attention. It's a ruse or a libel which is designed to turbocharge the call for Israel's destruction. And that is what is so, one of the things that is so unnerving about this is that no other country has been found guilty of the crime of apartheid since South Africa, the South African white regime. And if Israel is to be found guilty of the crime of apartheid, well, I mean, implicitly, that's a finding that Israel should be asphyxiated the way that the South African regime was. Israel and its friends have shown a lot of concern about the Icc, the current International Criminal Court investigation of Israel as being, one might say, overly aggressive militarily. Well, there are a lot of countries that are overly aggressive militarily and nobody calls for their destruction, right? The US, has been accused of being overly aggressive militarily, and Iraq and Afghanistan, nobody calls for its destruction, but to be labeled formally by the UN as engaged in apartheid, that's something you want to avoid if at all possible.
We have a question that seeks to broaden out the issue somewhat. The questioner states, though you are clearly concerned with the term apartheid, are you not concerned by the myriad of Israeli policies and actions that clearly treat Jews and Arabs differently, or do you reject the existence of these inequalities? So perhaps we put the extremity of apartheid to one side and focus on what this questioner alleges are policies and actions to treat Jews and Arabs differently. How would you respond to that?
Look, I think that there's a couple of reasons, as I mentioned, for why, does Israel treat Jews and Arabs differently? Yeah, sometimes it does. It drafts Jews into the military. It doesn't draft most Arabs into the military. I'm not a fan of Israel, of everything that Israel does in the West Bank, but first of all, it's not about race. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not about race. And second of all, even if the HRW definition were to be accepted, I don't think that Israel's treatment of its minorities rises to the level of what the apartheid regime did. First of all, it's a matter of motivation. Israel is not trying to maintain an institutionalized regime of systematic repression and domination by one racial group. Israel is left the Gaza Strip. It's a security conflict. The paradigm is belligerent occupation with regard to the West Bank. The paradigm is security concerns, not racism or discrimination for the sake of discrimination.
I mean, for what it's worth, one of the big takeaways I had from the Human Rights Watch report, and this is apparent from the very first sentence, is that it does very obviously seek to conflate Israeli Arabs and Palestinians in creating the straw man, if you will, that it seeks to then take down. And it also ignores the Palestinian Authority entirely and the self-governance that Palestinians practice in the West Bank. I also very much appreciate, or perhaps am conscious, that unpicking or seeking to pick apart the definition of apartheid does give credibility to something that is perhaps totally incredible. And if I may just add to your analysis in terms of the distinctions that you drew between Jews and Arabs, and the example that you gave is an accommodation that Arabs are not required to partake in national service, which is mandatory for all Jewish Israelis. They don't have to serve in the army because it's considered unfair to ask them to potentially fight other Arabs. But if those are the distinctions that we're addressing, then clearly they're not in any way ones that are discriminatory. And I would echo the comments that you made in terms of the opportunities afforded to Israeli Arabs, and perhaps just highlight the distinction of nationality. Which is something that it strikes me the Human Rights Watch report is very keen to gloss over. On that basis, I wonder, is there a generalized attempt, again more broadly, to delegitimize Jewish rights in the territory by claiming, and we see these charges of the Jews in Israel being called Europeans, or colonialists, and of course also the prevention of Jews from purchasing land. In comparison with the opportunities that are afforded to the Israeli Arabs, and looking at that level of discrimination, what are we to make of that discrimination?
Sure. I mean, beyond the sort of race question, right? I mean, if under the Human Rights Watch definition of apartheid, if you look at Israeli policies are far more mild than those of dozens of countries around the world. If you're going to expand apartheid to gender, well, what about what's happening in Saudi Arabia? If you're going to expand apartheid to religion, well, what about what's happening to the Uyghur Muslims in China? If you're going to claim that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict involves apartheid, well, I would say that it's actually the PA that is engaged in apartheid much more clearly than is Israel. Abbas has called for the removal of all Jews from the Palestinian state. There's a prohibition on selling land to Jews. this too is a kind of anti-Semitism, it seems to me, holding Israel to a totally different standard than holding anybody else. I have not seen a Human Rights Watch report discussing the PA as engaging in apartheid as per this new definition. And I have not seen the term apartheid bandied around vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia and Iran, which discriminates against the Baha'is. If you're going to have this broader definition, Israel is low down on the list of people who should be convicted of that crime, it seems to me.
And on the issue of incorporating new concepts into the definition, one question asks, the new definition of apartheid is used in this investigation that makes nationality and ethnicity the basis of apartheid rather than race that define the South African regime. What is the legitimacy of this new definition? Is there one?
So my view is that it's not legitimate, that this is, the definition of apartheid is set forth in these two, and I read the definitions, right? There's an apartheid treaty and there's the ICC statute. Both of them define apartheid in terms of race. Race is pivotal. And it seems to me that that's where the definition should stay. This is not the first time that there's been an effort to change international law so as to go after Israel. With regard to the ICC statute, the International Criminal Court statute, it's known that the language in the statute having to do with displacement of populations, settlements, et cetera, the language in the ICC statute was changed from the language that had previously been in international law. And it was changed at the request of the Arab League. They wanted to be able to accuse Israel of violating the law of armed conflict with regard to the settlements. The law at the time, the language of the law at the time was apparently insufficient. So they worked to broaden it. They didn't try, or maybe they didn't succeed in broadening the apartheid definition language. We certainly shouldn't allow them to get away with doing that now. You can't have, you can't change international laws just to hang Israel. That is anti-Semitism itself, it seems to me.
And not certainly in keeping with the equal application of international law. Two questions going to a very similar point. The first asks, who is driving and funding the apartheid accusations? And the second, who is exerting the enormous political pressure to pursue Israel? Do you have any insight into that?
Sure. So who is driving and funding this? Look, there has long been a move to accuse Israel of racism. They got the Zionism is racism resolution in 1975. It was abolished or rescinded in 1991. There's been the Durban conferences, which have tried to attach the accusation of racism to Israel. This is obviously a key element in the toolkit of those who are trying to delegitimize Israel. I think the Human Rights Watch report was pivotal. It's a remarkable thing. I'm sure they've managed to raise a lot of money off the fact that they, that invented this definition in their report, accused Israel of it, and 1 month later, they got a UN body tasked with explaining how Israel is in violation of that new definition. So clearly here, Human Rights Watch, and I don't know much about their donors, but I do know that Human Rights Watch has been criticized many times, including by their founder, in fact, for having an anti-Israel bias. And I think it's too bad.
A follow-up question here. The questioner writes, the allegations against Israel are quite absurd. And obviously some people are trying to abuse international law in order to fight Israel. is there a mechanism in place to put penalties on people who quite bluntly try to abuse international judicial systems? Something tells me our questioner may be disappointed with the response.
Wow. I mean, no. I mean, I'm not aware of any penalties in place for bringing, baseless charges under international law. The only penalty, I guess, is embarrassment if one loses. And as I mentioned at the beginning, what's to me is interesting about this move to label Israel formally, to have the UN formally label Israel with the allegation of apartheid, is that it's in its early stages. We've spotted it early on in this language in the mandate of the COI and in the 3 members of the COI, and there's time to push back. And I certainly hope that people who disagree with what is happening will push back, because this, it seems to me, is an issue on which there is still time and capacity to make a difference.
Further question, do you, Professor Kittrie, think that Israel should consider passing specific equalities legislation, such as that exists in the UK, for example, to help remedy any discrimination or perception thereof, even if that doesn't meet any definitional threshold of apartheid? And would you support the establishment of a human rights ombudsman in Israel, as has been recommended? It may be that.
What were you going to say?
Sorry, it may be, I mean, it's not something that is particularly a widespread phenomenon across different states, but do you think Israel would have anything to gain by adopting measures like that?
Look, I mean, that's going to be a challenge, a question for the Israelis. I do know, and I wrote about this in my book, Lawfare, which was informed by interviews with Israeli officials, that they took a lot of steps in response to the allegations that Israel was engaged in war crimes. I list in my book a number of steps they took, including increasing the role of the military advocate general, the military lawyers in targeting decisions. There were a whole series, and I think even creating a kind of ombudsman, there were a whole series of things that the Israelis did in response to the alleged war crimes, which, quite possibly, I think, helped Israel insulate itself a bit from those charges. Whether or not Israel should do something similar with regard to the apartheid charges, I don't have an opinion on that at this point, but I wouldn't be surprised to see people in the Israeli government doing that, looking at their own system, thinking about what is most sort of vulnerable, and maybe making changes, so long as the changes do not significantly undermine Israeli security.
A questioner writes, as much as I think the answer is obvious, I'd appreciate to hear it more elaborately from the professor. Accusers often use the law of return as proof of Israeli apartheid. What would the learned answer to that be?
Well, I mean, one answer is that lots and lots and lots of countries, first of all, the law of return is not about race. As I said before, the definition of apartheid has to do with race. Discrimination on the basis of race is essential to a finding of apartheid under the law as written in the Apartheid Treaty and the Icc. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not about race. The law of return does not discriminate against race. It does not say that Black Jews can't return to Israel. It does not say that Arab Jews cannot return to Israel. It is about religion, which is frankly a choice and not a racial matter. And I would note that, again, if you look at the constitutions or immigration laws of so many countries around the world, it is very, very difficult for new people to come and claim unless they have particular characteristics. And if you were going to look at quote unquote immigration laws and decide which most resembled the apartheid scheme, I think Israel would be very, very low on the list.
And perhaps also important to recognize in that context, not only the fundamental need for the state of Israel to exist in the relatively recent history, but also, of course, the fact that is often ignored, it would seem, in these discussions, and that is that it has been in a state of war for over 70 years. And in the context of that, the equality that you have described previously, I think, is perhaps an entirely unique phenomenon. We're asked for a little bit of perspective here, and whether you can talk about what else the UNHRC is focused on, or whether it is, in this respect, mainly about Israel, and similarly, a further question as to whether there are other countries, the example of China is given by this questioner, that are being technically ignored in respect of similar allegations.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that I am not aware of the UNHRC looking into whether any other country is committing the crime of apartheid. The UNHRC has for a long time had a very bad history of focusing on Israel to the exclusion of others. There are long lists available online, including lists compiled by UN Watch of the number of resolutions at the UN and the number of resolutions at the UNHRC that focus on Israel, while other countries, much worse deeds are ignored. The UNHRC, unfortunately, is dominated by dictatorships, and they seem to use it less to pursue human rights and more to distract from their own bad human rights records by attacking Israel and others who are undeserving of that kind of calumny. It's interesting to note that the Trump administration had withdrawn from the UNHRC. The Biden administration has said that they are re-engaging in the UNHRC. The US is in fact running for election to the UNHRC. The election is coming up in October. There are a number of quotes from Biden administration officials, including especially Secretary of State Tony Blinken, in which he said, well, we believe that it's not a good idea to leave the UNHRC to the dictators. We're going to re-engage, and we think only by engaging can we make a positive difference. Now, one of the things that I'm planning to write shortly is that, in fact, the Biden administration's re-engagement has coincided with the UNHRC launching its what appears to be its worst ever attack on Israel. Rather than things getting better, they seem to be getting worse, with, as I mentioned, this commission of inquiry that has a broader mandate and a much more dangerous mandate than any of the previous commissions of inquiry. So if you're going to engage, it seems to me, and you're going to promise to do better, it seems to me you should be held accountable for a failure to do that. That is, I think, is something that I plan to do and that others might want to do as well.
Now, we have a very learned audience from around the world, so we're allowing points of information as well as questions on this occasion. And one is that the Human Rights Watch definition of racial group is grounded on the International Convention for the Elimination of All forms of racial discriminations, definition of racial discrimination, and the reference there is to Article 1. This questioner says there is a real question whether it can be transposed by analogy into international criminal law. And that reflects a number of other questions as to what impact this definition, if it is adopted by the Commission of Inquiry, might have with respect to the ICC. So do you have some thoughts on the cross-fertilization, if you will, of different areas of law with these terms?
Yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation, HRW unpersuasively extrapolated, I think was the term that I used in my presentation, from legal instruments, including the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. I was a State Department lawyer for 10 years. I've taught international law for 17 years. I didn't find it persuasive, but the challenge in the international legal arena is that definitions can change. They can be changed by sort of customary international law mechanisms, by opinio juris. So to the degree that Human Rights Watch, or especially the UNHRC, is saying that the definition has changed, that could be, in theory, used as a point by the ICC to say, well, yes, our definition says the following, but we, interpret it more broadly because the international legal definition has changed. Now, I am hopeful that an aggressive campaign to point out that HRW says it's changed, but it hasn't changed. That's not a legitimate statement that it's changed. That this can, if not persuade the UNHRC to drop its pursuit of that broader definition, the ICC is a legal body, and the new prosecutor at the ICC, Karim Khan, from what I can tell, is a serious international lawyer. And, I don't think that he is going to just willy-nilly adopt a definition, especially if there's been a strong case made that the definition is incorrect. And it's interesting to note that one interesting player in this may be Justice Richard Goldstone. He was the author of the UNHRC's Goldstone report, which harshly criticized military tactics. He had previously been appointed to the South African Constitutional Court by Nelson Mandela. Goldstone has stated that the charge that Israel is an apartheid state is a false and malicious one. And it happens that Goldstone was the chair of a commission which did recently a very broad review of the International Criminal Court. It was a commission appointed by the International Criminal Court's members, and Goldstone, among other things, called on the International Criminal Court to narrow its focus, to be more careful about what it pursues. So to the degree that he reiterates that Israel is not an apartheid state, given his position as head of a kind of audit body of the ICC, somebody like him can make a difference, and as well as perhaps redeeming himself for the role that he played previously in the Goldstone report, which he then recanted, but nevertheless, some damage was done.
I'm only sorry that we're running out of time. We've had a follow-up question on the first question I put with respect to Israeli policies and actions that asks how you would address, in light of your earlier answer, the nation state law, evictions, ability to apply for permits, building permits, that is, and challenges in East Jerusalem, etc. If I could refer our audience to the great wealth of videos that exist, webinar recordings on the UKLFI Charitable Trust YouTube page, where each of those issues have been dealt with in substantial detail, then hopefully we can deal with those responses in that way. And I can conclude by asking you two final questions in relation to the role of states in response to their campaign that you have set out. The first is, how are more moderate Arab states placed in the political pressure against Israel? For example, Egypt and Jordan, or indeed the members of the Abraham Accords. And do we know how they might be voting on these sorts of topics?
So that is a very interesting question. Obviously, to the extent that the UAE or Bahrain comes out and takes a position helpful to Israel, that has some resonance. I would think it more likely that the UAE or Bahrain would come out and take such a position. Egypt in particular has been pretty hostile to Israel in international organizations. Jordan has a very large Palestinian population who they are eager not to antagonize. But overall, I would say that the Abraham Accords have been positive for Israel. Obviously, it shows a widening acceptance of Israel in the region. I have know that there have been some institutions in the UAE and Bahrain that have partnered on sort of human rights and anti-Semitism issues with Israeli institutions. I have not seen those two governments, which I consider, as I said, the most likely, going to bat yet in international organizations for Israel. I hope they will, but this is a battle that will need to be waged regardless of what position that they take.
And finally, what do you suggest the role of foreign governments should now be in relation to claims brought against Israel as an apartheid state? And perhaps in light of the answer just given, we can focus that on Israel's allies.
Yeah,
long-standing allies.
So there are a couple of things that, as I mentioned, there are a couple of groups of countries that have been very helpful to Israel on somewhat analogous issues. The countries that have dropped out of Durban, the countries that made submissions on Israel's behalf at the ICC. And it seems to me that they need to find appropriate ways to express the view that Israel's actions do not constitute apartheid. They presumably can have some influence at the UNHRC. The COI is going to be issuing its report in June 2022. Typically, the report will be endorsed by the members of the UNHRC. The mandate actually just barely passed. There were 24 votes in favor of the mandate, 9 abstentions, and 14 countries, 9 against the mandate and 14 countries that abstained. It may be possible to create a situation where the members of the UNHRC indicate that they're not going to endorse a report accusing Israel of apartheid. That's a task for diplomacy. But if they indicate that to the members of the COI, the members of the COI don't want to embarrass themselves by having their report shot down. So they may well moderate. And again, the UNHRC and Michelle Bachelet, who's the High Commissioner, Bachelet has apparently repeatedly said that she is getting pressure, including from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, to go after Israel. She has told people that HRW and AI say that's their top priority, going after Israel. That's the #1 thing they want her to do. To the extent that there are others who push back, I think that can make a difference.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for taking the time. As you say, in an arena in which often these subjects are so responsive, it's so important to have had your incredible briefing well in advance of the publication of this report. I'm sure many organizations watching your remarks will be spurred on to do their bit to push back, to educate on these issues. And we're very grateful indeed for the expertise and the analysis that you've been able to provide. I would like to take a moment just to wish all our Jewish viewers very well over the fast, Gmar Chatima Tova, and thank you very much indeed for joining us on this occasion.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.